Hi, this is Jennifer Benolken with DuPont. I am a medical device manufacturer and regulatory specialist within the company, working with downstream medical device manufacturers, such as my guest today, Dan Burgess. Dan has recently worked on a project to support the efforts for coronavirus with respect to rapidly developing a ventilator. So Dan, I'm going to have you introduce yourself.
Thanks for the introduction, Jen. A little bit about myself first. So I'm a packaging engineering fellow with Boston Scientific. Been with the company for almost 15 years. Prior to that, for about 8 years, I designed and built plastic injection molds. So have kind of some manufacturing tooling knowledge and things like that as well prior to getting into packaging, which has been helpful in the packaging field as well. So, having that manufacturing experience, physically building things is proved to be useful. Things that I typically work on within the company. So I've got a couple of different areas that I focus on. One is standards. So as part of the standards effort for Boston Scientific, I'm a representative within ASTM, and I've been involved in ASTM for many years, just first as a member, then as a sub-chair, and then now as the chair of F2 Primary Barrier Packaging Committee, and also as a participant in D10 Committee on Packaging. And then another area that I'm involved with on behalf of the company is exploratory packaging. So within exploratory packaging for Boston Scientific, we're looking at things like new materials, new test methods, new packaging designs. And then the third area of focus for myself is ownership of our packaging test lab in Minnesota. So I have responsibility of that. And then as part of kind of all the activities, I have a few direct reports that I supervise. So, that covers a wide range of activities, which is great because, it makes for an interesting job. From day to day, things are changing all the time. And so, I really appreciate the role that I get to fill for the company.
Yeah, I totally get that. So can you talk to the concept of being a fellow for a couple of minutes? I think that's something that probably a lot of people aspire to, but they may not necessarily know exactly what it means or what an honor it is to be a fellow.
Yeah, sure, Jen. So, that title fellow, I'm sure, as with other companies, is somewhat of a honorary position. Typically, it's technical in nature, technically focused, and versus the management track. Within Boston Scientific, we do just have at this time only just one person from packaging in that position. That's myself, and being the first person to take on that role is kind of been an interesting journey. Filled with opportunities and challenges. So I do appreciate having that opportunity, and look forward to other folks filling that role in the future as well as the opportunity presents itself. One of the challenges from being in a fellow type role where you're viewed as a technical leader for a particular function typically is a lot of times your interests primarily lie on the technical side, and that's kind of how you got there. But oftentimes you still have to provide support from a management perspective, where you're supervising others. And so there's always that conflict between, trying to be technically minded, technically focused, and then also trying to wear that hat of supervising and managing people as well. So that's not always true for every fellow in their role, but I know many fellows still have to wear both hats. So that's where one of the main challenges can come in from.
Absolutely, totally get that. I'm sure there's some mentorship going on as well, even if people don't technically report directly to you.
Yes, that's true. So, one of the roles that technical fellows typically will also fulfill is in the area of mentorship. So for myself, a couple of areas where I provide mentorship externally is through a couple of different universities, so University of Minnesota, as well as University of Wisconsin-Stout, the packaging program there, where I help develop a medical device packaging program, and then also teach a couple sessions of that throughout the semester each year, along with other industry professionals that help develop that program. And then internally, one of the areas where I provide some mentorship besides packaging for our packaging engineering group is on the statistical side of things. So that's an area of interest for me. So that's one of the things that I get involved in from a technical perspective besides packaging.
So Dan, you and I were talking a few weeks ago, and you mentioned this project that you're working on, and again, that's what brought us here today. Can you explain a little bit about this project? The fun part is that, and maybe you didn't see this as a fun part, was that it wasn't necessarily a sterile barrier that you were working on, which is somewhat atypical for packaging engineers in medical device companies. I mean, there's always the outer packaging, the shelf carton, if you will, or the carrier that gets the sterile barrier system with the device inside to the end user. But it's not always typical that packaging engineers within medical device companies actually work on non-sterile products. So, introduce the project that you worked on, how you came to be involved, share whatever you want to share about what you found was interesting about the project.
Yeah, sure. So the particular project, that I think we want to talk about here is a simple ventilator design that was, the concept was developed at the University of Minnesota. And then, they reached out to some medical device manufacturers for support to manufacture this device. So, it could be offered out to, folks in need during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, as part of that partnership, Boston Scientific, Medtronic, University of Minnesota, as well as a distributor for distributing the devices, the United Health Group, kind of all came together to work on pulling this together to manufacture it and get it out to potential users. Now, kind of the beauty of this device is its simplicity, meaning that it can't perform all of the typical functions of a ventilator, but that's a good thing from the standpoint of it will work with many different types of bags that could be used to help a patient maintain their breathing if they have the COVID-19 virus. And it also is very simple and easy to operate, meaning you don't need maybe as extensive training to use the device. Now, with that said, it's not meant to, because it doesn't have all the same functions as a normal ventilator, it's not meant to operate on its own. It still needs to be something that is kind of meant to take the place of somebody, squeezing an ambu bag. Obviously one person can't do that for very long. So it kind of takes the place of that, takes the pressure off of our healthcare providers short term, but they still need to be near so they can monitor the device's function and the patient to make sure that they're okay. It just allows them to maybe do a couple of other tasks while this machine is taking the place of that manual activity.
So Dan, is this like an interim part of a patient being ventilated then? Like the healthcare facility recognizes that the patient needs to be vented. They may not have the equipment readily available, or they have to go and get it, whatever. So instead of having, again, like you said, someone standing there squeezing a bag of air into people's lungs, it does that for them for a short period of time as an interim to getting to the ventilator?
Yeah, that's correct, right? So, obviously, your typical full-blown ventilator has a lot of features and functions and, a cost associated with that. And this is kind of like a simplistic tool. It's basically a squeezer, right? So it's squeezing the bag to pump the air into the patient. to keep them breathing.
Okay.
Just performing that basic function. It does have some adjustability, for example, as far as how fast it can do that. That's I bet that's mainly the main thing that can be adjusted. So like the amount of compression that's occurring or that the machine is doing isn't really adjustable, but the rate is. So that's the one thing that they could adjust if they needed to. But if you can imagine, like in certain places where maybe equipment, they couldn't afford to buy the equipment, or they don't have all the training that they might need to have to run one of the more sophisticated ventilators. Something like this really fills that role of providing or kind of bridging that gap between your normal sophisticated ventilator and somebody just having to do it completely by hand.
Sure. So okay, so the device is being developed. When did packaging get called? It's clearly it's a much accelerated project than what we would typically experience. So yeah, how did it all happen? How did it unroll?
Yeah, so I would say your typical kind of start to finish, not for a novel technology, but for kind of your everyday run-of-the-mill, med device new product development project. You're talking probably a range of 1 to 3 years to kind of beginning to end to complete that, depending on the complexity of the device. So, the U of M had a concept already when I was made aware of this, and basically we took that concept. There was no packaging or labeling or any of that kind of stuff. It was just the device. We took that concept, and within a month we went from the concept to manufacturing it full out, right? So really the only way that we could do that is because we had all of these really great partnerships between the University, Boston Scientific, Medtronic, the FDA, who put some special rules in place that allowed us to make sure that a quality product was being made, but be a little bit more flexible about how we were going to document everything, and how testing was going to be done and all that kind of stuff, right? And because of those partnerships and the strength of those partnerships, that allowed us to move this quickly. And also, I would say the people that worked on the project too, right? So, one of the things that, was a key takeaway on this project for me was, nobody, we all worked long hours, we worked weekends. Everybody on the team did whatever they could to get this done because we knew the urgency associated with it, the value of it to the potential, patients that were going to receive the treatment from it. And nobody complained. Everybody just did what they needed to do. And that was, really awesome. I really, enjoyed that part of the project. Packaging was involved, as early on as all the other functions. So that was great to see as well.
So how did the packaging roll out for this? I mean, if the U of M had already been working on it prior to approaching you, so it's clearly, you take the 1 to 3 year process that you were describing that we typically go through and compress it into 1 month, which is just astounding in and of itself and quite spectacular. How did they approach you when they first came and said, hey, we need packaging for this device?
Yeah, so, that kind of came down through our upper management. A need was identified for all the different functions that were going to be required to support, final development and manufacture of the product, which obviously it does include packaging and labeling. And kind of the approach that I took from a packaging perspective was, like you noted early on in our discussion, this particular device wasn't going to require a sterile barrier, wasn't being sterilized. It's more like a piece of capital equipment essentially, or a medical electrical equipment. And so that does simplify things a bit because we don't have to worry about, creating and maintaining that sterile barrier or sterility. So that did help. But one of the things that was a challenge is that, even though the university had, kind of a prototype design and everything, and we knew we weren't going to change that a lot, there were some things around, the length of the device and, the motors that were being used and all that kind of stuff that affected the profile or the outer shape of the device. And so, that was something that I guess I recognized pretty early on as being a challenge to packaging because most of the time when you have a piece of capital equipment, what you end up doing, if it has any weight, that's for sure, is, putting in place some type of cushioning system to prevent damage to it. And that's usually, pre-cut foam that has to have some level of precision associated with it. Well, if your form factor is kind of, morphing and changing a little bit, it's pretty tough to commit to precision cut foam that you're going to put around this thing and put it in a shipper box. So the strategy that I ended up using was actually kind of a two-phased approach, which was, all right, we want to get building these things as quickly as possible, and the design is still kind of morphing a little bit. So let's use something that's really flexible to kind of do a phase one packaging concept. So we ended up using these foam in place bags. I don't know how many folks are familiar with those, but maybe you've received packaging from Amazon or other vendors where this concept was utilized, and usually it's used on heavier, consumer products, TVs, things like that. And so the way that they work is, basically there's chemicals that come in a bag that's kind of folded up into a small pouch. You open that out, you mix the chemicals together, and an exothermic reaction takes place. And when those two chemicals mix and that reaction takes place, basically it creates a polyurethane foam that fills in any gaps in the package and provides support and cushioning for your device. And so we used 3 of those packs to fill out the shipper box where this device was being placed, and that kind of allowed that design to change without a need to really do much else from a packaging standpoint to accommodate those changes. So it was a very flexible design. And then for the second phase, we, once the shape or the form factor of the device was finalized and there wasn't any significant changes to that, we did the pre-cut foam approach, which is, better from the standpoint of assembly, right? It's a much faster, easier, quicker process. And so we gained a lot of speed that way. So that's kind of how I approached it.
That's great. Did you guys think about like suspension packaging at all, or would the weight of the device not have allowed that?
Yeah, so this device is probably about 18 pounds. So, suspension packaging, at least the designs that I've worked with in the past, is typically more so for things that maybe are, a couple pounds or less. And so this seemed like this was, a device that probably was going to need more structural support than a suspension package could provide.
Sure, absolutely. So Dan, when they approached you, kind of stepping back again to the beginning of the process, you mentioned a little bit ago about how the key takeaway for you was how everyone just pitched in. They worked long hours, weekends, did whatever it took. I would say, and this may not be your experience, but I think it's a stereotypical experience of packaging professionals within medical device organizations where they don't always feel valued. It often feels like packaging is an afterthought or not important, even though, those of us that do packaging recognize that it is.
I guess, I can't speak to how other companies do things. But, so I can just speak from my experience, with my company, Boston Scientific, and that is that, almost always packaging is pulled in as early as it makes sense, right? There's certain, phases of a project really early on where it may not necessarily make sense, but I think our company does a really good job of pulling in the packaging engineering function and getting them included as early as possible. So, I think that's great to see. But that didn't just happen, right? So that happened, over the years, and it happened for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, we had some great leadership in place that pushed for that. But it also happened because I think other functions recognized over time, and this is something that I think maybe a little unique to Boston Scientific or other companies that have employees that stay with the company for a fair amount of time, is that if you're doing this long enough, you see or experience things where packaging, if it's not focused on or if it's ignored, it can become a problem and it can slow down a project or it can prevent a product from launching, right? And so, once you've had some of those experiences, pretty quickly you come to understand that, well, if we ignore this or if we treat it as something that's not as important as, other aspects of the device or our manufacturing or other processes, it's really going to compromise our ability to get this product out on time. And so it deserves, the same focus as everything else.
Fair response. Thank you. So Dan, how is it different than working on an SBS or sterile barrier system that we would typically work on? You've kind of touched on some of it. There had to have been some testing. You also discussed talking with the FDA or coordinating with the FDA. That even though some of the normal activities that an organization would go through to develop a product were probably quote unquote waived in this, not all of them could be. So what were some of the things that you guys did? You mentioned as part of your job and role, you managed the lab. There had to have been some testing on the packaging. How is it different than SBS? Did you use some of the same test methods? What did you guys do to qualify the packaging as sufficient to get the device in a usable form to the user?
Yeah, so I would say, kind of the high-level approach that the team took was we looked at, all the requirements. So a good requirements review was done for the type of device that this is, and then we looked at, okay, well, from a regulatory standpoint, what requirements are being relaxed, and then we looked at, what testing and further work on requirements absolutely has to be done, and which things can we leverage from previous product or previous experiences, or put together, engineering rationale to basically say, well, here's why we're not going to do it. And, usually that's focused around risk, right? So if it's a low risk thing or no risk to the patient, we kind of scoped it out of the project, or, if there was an allowance from the FDA, we scoped it out of the project. And so by doing that, that really reduced, the amount of work that the team had to do. So that's kind of the high-level approach that we took. But from a packaging standpoint, the main thing that we had to do with this particular type of device was, just ensure that its ability to arrive at the customer in a functioning order was assessed. And the way that we did that was we looked at what are the main hazards to this particular device. And so the main hazards are, we don't have a sterile barrier, but a lot of the same hazards that a sterile barrier would be concerned with, we had to assess, right? So shock and vibration, temperature and humidity. So those are the four main hazards that we were concerned with. So we basically subjected the device and the packaging system to those hazards by using, standardized methods, whether it was elements of D4169 or ISTA series, climatic conditioning. And then we assess device function after exposure to those hazards. And obviously, the main thing there was just to make sure that after it saw those conditions, it still functioned, it still worked for the amount of time that we expected it to work.
Moving into kind of a tangential or even close to the conversation, if you will, how do you see this process that you just went through changing what we as an industry do into the future? You guys clearly had to think a lot quicker, do a lot quicker, produce a lot quicker. How do you see this changing the typical 1 to 3 year development process that we typically go through?
Well, I mean, the main thing for me is that, it showed how fast something can get done with some caveats, right? So like we talked about before, we had some, reductions in the number of typical requirements and, some more flexibility around what we might be able to write engineering rationales for, or testing that we might be able to leverage that, in normal circumstances wouldn't be available. So that was a significant, benefit to the team as far as speed. The other thing that was a benefit was, management, high level of management support to say basically, no, you need to focus on this, because it's really important and get it done. And so what that allows also the individuals on the team to do is, normally, I'm sure we've all experienced this, right? You're usually not just working on one thing, you're working on 20, 30, 40, 50 things, right? And so it's constant, management of your time to try and figure out, okay, what do I got to work on right now? What do I got to work on an hour from now? And what do I got to work on next week? Whereas, this project, the team members were kind of like, all right, we're shutting everything else off and we're just doing this, right? So a lot of focus on one thing allowed the team to move pretty fast. And so I would say, other than the, kind of the regulatory piece, one of the things that might change in the future is, management might say, look, we know we can move faster if we just remove distractions or reduce the number of projects that we're giving to a particular team or a particular, person or engineer. So that's a strategy that maybe they might employ more often.
So Dan, to wrap this up, what's the one thing that you would want listeners to this this discussion to take away with them coming out of listening?
Wow, you're throwing out the easy questions, Jen. Maybe it's probably, it's not the most technical answer that, maybe some people are looking for, but, the main takeaway from me was that, prior to having this opportunity to work with this team and on this particular project, I was working on a lot of different things and, wasn't necessarily always feeling a lot of passion. And when I got to work on this project and with this team, that's one of the things that I really kind of got a great sense of was, some excitement, some passion around this, just seeing other people, working really hard along with me to try to accomplish, this goal to help people and everybody coming together to work on it. And that was kind of my main takeaway, was kind of a sense of pride and accomplishment from this effort.
That is a most excellent way to end this conversation. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I think the people listening to this will appreciate it as well.
Thanks for the opportunity, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again in the future, Jen.